The year was 1914. Archduke Franz Ferdinand of the Austro-Hungarian Empire was on a state visit to Sarajevo, when his driver took a wrong turn and drove him right into Gavrilo Princip, a 19-year-old student, armed and trained by the Serbian government, fatally shot Franz Ferdinand and his wife, triggering the First World War that would rewrite human history forever. Gavrilo Princip was one of the many Slavs who had common aspirations for Yugoslavia, an independent country for all the southern Slavic people. The death of Franz Ferdinand was sent shockwave across Europe and quickly led to a series of diplomatic as well as military escalations among the major European powers. Less than 2 months after the assassinations, the great powers were at each other's throat in a fight for survival. What was originally an outbreak of hostility quickly escalated into a full-scale violence that produced one of the worst global conflicts. The war was a suicide pact by the European monarchies. In less than 4 years, the German Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Russian Empire would perish along with 40 million innocent lives. How did a centuries of international peace and order established after the defeat of Napoleon, a system of balance of power created by the great statesman of Metternich, maintained by Otto von Bismarck, collapsed so disastrously upon the hands of a 19-year-old student fighting for Yugoslavia? This is the story of the great power struggle of Europe, from its very beginning to its very end. Our story begins with the origin of the southern Slavic people at around 5th century AD. At this time, the Byzantine Empire has reached the zenith of her power under Emperor Justinian I. Beyond its frontiers to the north, situated a group of tribes known as the Slav, and they share a deep common root of culture, language, and religion. Throughout the next several hundred years, many Slavs would migrate into the impoverished land of the Balkans in the Byzantine Empire, which is modern-day Bulgaria, Serbia, and Croatia. Together, they would form an individual tribal society which continue their own culture and way of living for many years to come, despite living in Roman territories. The 7th century marked the arrival of two powerful Slavic tribes, the Croats and the Serbs, who would eventually evolve into the modern nation-states of Croatia and Serbia. Together they laid down the linguistic foundations of the modern-day Serbo-Croatian dialect, of which Kosovo, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Montenegro are a part of. Slovenian, North Macedonian and Bulgarian also belongs to the very same dialect continuum. These rich linguistic and cultural roots forged a shared identity among these new arrivals, who would eventually be known as the Yugoslav, translating into the Southern Slavs. And it was at the capital of Bosnia-Herzegovina, Sarajevo, where 2 gunshots would alter the fate of humanities. The Balkan is a product of geopolitics. It is the most linguistically, culturally, religiously diverse region in the world because of her unique geography, being at the crossroad between Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. For centuries, it was the point of contact between the Eastern and Western Roman Empire, between Catholicism and Orthodox, two rival schools of Christianity. The Western Roman Empire would collapse at around 500 AD, while the Eastern Roman Empire lingered for another millennium until the rise of a new power from the east, the Ottoman, an Islamic caliphate arriving at the doorstep of the Christian world when they breached the Wall of Constantinople at 1453 with the use of gunpowder. The center of Orthodox was expelled into the Russian Empire. With the bridgehead of Constantinople secure, the road to Europe lay wide open for the taking. The Balkan state, sandwiched between the two arenas, were at the mercy of their Muslim overlord, either be subjugated to Ottoman's rule or face conquest and bloodshed. The Ottoman Empire would amass troops across the Strait of Constantinople into the heartland of Europe. The Battle of Kosovo at 1400 marked the defeat of the Serbian Empire. The Ottoman went on to devour much of Balkan, only to be defeated by a coalition of Christian army led by the Holy Roman Empire at the Gate of Vienna at 1683. However, the Ottoman would retain much of the Balkans for years to come, establishing Muslim rule over its territory. One thing for sure, the Southern Slavic people would not breathe another air of freedom for the next 500 years. The area was unfortunately just an extension of the geopolitical struggles between empire for competing spheres of influence. The story of Balkan is intertwined with the great power struggle of Europe. One of these great powers was Russia, a fellow Slavic state who would rise to great power status within the next several hundred years, and they would expand beyond their European territory into the deserted Siberia and at one point across North America into Alaska. In Central Europe, the Holy Roman Empire, once the most powerful European state of the Middle Ages, slowly disintegrated into a confederacy comprised of hundreds of individual kingdoms, each ruled by their own ruler. This highly decentralized political entity enjoyed remarkable longevity and stability for centuries, until one of the most consequential and significant episodes in human history burst out at its doorstep: the French Revolution. In 1789, a fiscal and agricultural crisis was brewing for years after the economic mismanagement by the French monarchy. Refusing to compromise, Louis XVI dissolved the parliament and banned them from assembling. Shocked and furious, the parliamentarians would rebel and met at a nearby tennis court and swore not to disperse until new constitutions had been agreed. Meanwhile, the people of Paris, long been the victims of unemployment and food shortages, revolts and attacked the Bastille. The uprising would quickly escalate into a full-scale revolution against the Asian feudal regimes of privilege and nobility. The parliament would quickly enact a series of radical reforms promoting liberty and equality, and eventually leading to the executions of Louis XVI. The French Revolution is the complete reordering of society, revolutionizing our understanding of the nature of political power, and most importantly, redefining the relationship between the rulers and those they ruled. Amid this chaos, a young Napoleon Bonaparte begins his meteoric rise to power, a military genius leading France to a series of impossible victories in the French Revolutionary War. He became the de facto leader of France after seizing political power in 1799 in a coup d'etat at the age of 30. The other monarchies of Europe were shocked and threatened by the spread of revolutionary ideas. They would quickly form a series of coalitions to fight against the new French Republic. Napoleon would defy all odds and shattered the coalition on multiple occasions, and single-handedly destroyed the Holy Roman Empire into dissolution at the Battle of Austerlitz. However, his disastrous invasions of Russia in 1812 would mark the beginnings of his downfall. Soon afterward, the coalition force led by Duke of Wellington went on to defeat Napoleon and the First French Empire at the Battle of Waterloo. Napoleon and the French Revolution changed the European continent forever. The conquest of Napoleon, stretching from Spain all the way to Russia, would export many of the revolutionary ideas that would have enduring impact in Europe, including democracy, due process of law, the abolishment of serfdom, introductions of legal code, and limits and constraints to the power of church and monarchies. These ideas would later underpin the foundations of our modern society. The Napoleonic War was not just a war fought between monarchies, but a people's war with mass conscriptions and mobilization as the whole society committed all their economic and industrial resources to fight the war. It encouraged national solidarity as the whole country mobilized against a common enemy. Napoleon would awake the national consciousness of the Germanic people, the Italian people, and the Slavic people, leading to the national ideologies of pan-Germanism and pan-Slavism. The French revolutions gave birth to the concept of nationalism. This period also saw the emergence of modern nation-state with an organized armed forces, a large-scale capacity for taxations, coercive control over their populations, and an able bureaucracy that is based on meritocracy, are structures of society that rewards life chances to those who are talented rather than to those who are privileged. Finally, and most importantly, a national mythology that binds together the fabrics of society, a common beliefs structures that anchor upon a shared linguistic and cultural identity which justify the existence of a nation-state. By 1815, Napoleon was dethroned. Europe would enjoy relative peace and stability for the first time in decades. But the scale of destructions of the Napoleonic War was so disastrous for the whole continent. The representative of the major power would gather at the Congress of Vienna at 1815, not only to stabilize European international order, but to conclude a settlement that would prevent future violence and conflict from arising. They were the representative of Europe who would try to set up a political system that ensured peace in Europe for the first time in history. And it is against this backdrop two of the greatest statesmen of the 19th century emerged out of obscurity. Metternich and Viscount Castlereagh, the two principal architects of the New World Order. Metternich, the foreign minister of the Austrian Empire, knew that the new liberal and revolutionary ideas were particularly threatening to his empire, a complex multi-ethnic political entity governed by an autocratic monarchies. Also, another Napoleon could just emerge at any time at the doorstep of Austria, the unavoidable vulnerability of a continental power. Therefore, Metternich knew that only solidarity among monarchies could constrain the dangers of another liberal revolutions, and most importantly, permit the fragile Austria to survive. The British Foreign Secretary Viscount Castlereagh was perhaps the only British politician to understand Metternich's ambitions and reasoning, and also the need for an organized European order. The solutions to all these problems is the balance of power. The principle are the followings. Firstly, the great powers must unite and resist any unilateral attempt at universal dominations from any single power. And in order to discourage such an attempt, an equilibrium of force must exist among the major power. Thirdly, buffer states are created to serve as shock absorber. The 39 Germanic states established after the dissolutions of the Holy Roman Empire were to be disunited in the interests of peace, to prevent a major direct border between the great powers that could spark potential confrontations. And finally, periodic conferences were set up so that great power could consult each other's interests for the maintenance of the peace of Europe. The Congress of Vienna gave birth to this 19th century primitive form of United Nations. Instead of the United Nations Charter, the constitutions of this system as the collective consensus among powers to the principle of the balance of power. And instead of the United Nations Security Council we have today, the principal watchdog of the system is the individual willingness of the power themselves to enforce this principle on each other. The peacemaker of Vienna tried to restore the old monarchical system as much as possible without acknowledging the force of nationalism that was about to wreck the continent shortly afterwards. The first major blow to the system was the revolutions of 1848. A new spirit of liberalism and nationalism galvanized the people of Europe, leading to a series of major revolts and uprisings across the continent against the old monarchical structures and against the outcome of the Congress of Vienna. Starting with Italy, the people revolt against the French rule and called for a confederacy of all the Italian states. Meanwhile, the people of France overthrew the French monarchy and drafted a new constitution that proclaimed France as a democratic republic with direct universal suffrage and the separations of power. The Hungarian patriots revolted against the Austrian Empire, which later spiraled into a war of independence, pushing the Austrian to the verge of collapse. The Germans, influenced by pan-Germanism, were calling for the unification of all the German-speaking states into one nation. They led a series of coordinated rebellion and protests in many German states that would eventually be known as the German Revolutions. They protest against the autocratic political structures of the 39 independent German states, products of the Congress of Vienna, which separates Germans from one another. Although the rebellion and riots were struck down, it laid down the foundations for the establishment of a unified German state. By 1871, a new generation of statesmen have arisen in Europe who were ambitious for their own country and were no longer willing to follow the principle established in Vienna. One of them was Chancellor Otto von Bismarck. The ingenious Realpolitik would gobble up the rest of the German-speaking area into a newly unified empire of Germany, headed by King Wihelm I. This Prussian-dominated entity would replace Austria as the dominant power in Central Europe. In a similar token, the Italian nationalistic movement would reach its completion in 1871 after the capture of Rome. The consolidations of different states of the Italian peninsula into a single unified country was finally completed, and the Kingdom of Italy was born. By this time, all the buffer states, once served as shock absorber, had now disappeared with the completions of the Italian and German unifications. The great power had now a long common border and were rubbing up against each other uncomfortably, making frictions between them more likely. At this point, the Austrian Empire was slowly crumbling. After the Hungarian revolutions of 1848, Austrian Emperor Franz Joseph was forced to transform the empire into a dual monarchy between Austria and Hungary. The territorial integrity and the historical constitutions of Hungary was finally restored, but as Balkan nationalism crippled, the compromise was only temporary in nature. The world seems to be at ease as the revolutions were struck down by the European monarchies, but a crisis was slowly brewing in the Far East. By late 18th century, the Ottoman Empire, failing to modernize its army, its bureaucracy, and its system of finance, was declining rapidly, and she had earned the nickname the Sick Man of Europe. Her neighbor, Russia, ambitious as well as opportunistic, took advantage of the situations in multiple occasions, annexing Ottoman's territory through a series of military campaigns, the most significant being the Russo-Turkish War of 1877, pushing Ottoman out of Europe and right at the doorstep of Constantinople. Along with the rise of pan-slavism, the Balkans revolt, the Ottoman was on the verge of total collapse in a period known as the Great Eastern Crisis. As the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire was believed to be imminent, the European powers engaged in a power struggle to safeguard their own military, strategic and commercial interests in the Ottoman domain. The power vacuum left behind by the Ottomans' exit from the Balkan intensified the competitions between major power and greatly undermined the already fragile balance of power. In order to reduce the risk of conflict and war between great powers, German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck set up a series of diplomatic conferences in Berlin to manage the disintegrations of Ottoman Empire in an orderly fashion and try to re-establish the equilibrium between great powers based on the principle of the balance of power. Both the United Kingdom and the Russian Empire have serious strategic interests in the Balkan region by the late 19th century. The United Kingdom, through the dominance of her navy, controlled the entire Mediterranean Sea, patiently waiting to colonize Egypt and Palestine. The Strait of Bosporus, or the Strait of Constantinople, connecting the Black Sea with the Mediterranean Sea, has significant geopolitical value till today. The Black Sea hosts Russia's only deep warm water port that remains unfrozen all year round. Therefore, the strait is the lifeline for Russia, militarily as well as economically, connecting her with the rest of the world. A pro-Russia Bulgaria, created after the Russo-Turkish War of 1877, could allow Russian Black Sea Fleet greater access into the Mediterranean Sea, posing a grave threat to the British naval power and her sphere of influence in southern Europe. On the other hand, Russia was by now the dominant power in Balkans, as a leading Orthodox state and as a pan-Slavic unifier. She was enjoying great success and support from Bulgaria, Serbia and Greece. Russia was now looking to control the Strait of Bosporus and to expand her interests beyond the Mediterranean. Meanwhile, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, bordering the fragile empires of Ottoman, also had her own sets of colonial ambitions and wanting to expand into the Balkan. With these strategic interests in mind, the great power now have to work out the new map for Balkan. Bismarck and all the other powers were particularly suspicious of Russia, and they would sabotage a pro-Russia Greater Bulgaria by any means possible. So under the influence of Bismarck, the Congress will strip the Ottoman many of their European possessions but refused to grant them to Russia and massively reduced the size of Bulgaria. To ensure the balance of power, Bismarck's solutions was to give Austria dominance in the western area and Russia in the eastern area. Bosnia and a strip of land was granted to Austro-Hungarian Empire to keep the Slavic states disunited by separating Serbia and Montenegro. The Congress of Berlin was a harsh blow to pan-Slavism. There was a deep sense of betrayal among Russia and the Balkan states, as all their gains and sacrifices were cheated by the Congress, in particular by Bismarck. The settlement led to rising antagonism between the Russian Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The Congress failure to resolve the Macedonian questions would later lead to the Two Balkans War in 1912 and 1913, with Serbia end up controlling much of it. Continued and rising nationalism in the Balkan was one of the latent causes of the First World War, happened decades later. The star of the Congress of Berlin was Otto von Bismarck's. His diplomacy of Realpolitik and his powerful home rule quickly earned him the nickname the Iron Chancellor. By integrating and expanding into the German states, one served as shock absorber. He has in fact contributed so powerfully to the destructions of the old Vienna system. But with Prussia's dominance over unified Germany accomplished by 1871, he was a complete changed character and wanted nothing else but peace to retain Germany's favorable positions. By now, the decentralized system of Vienna based on consensus and collective principle has collapsed because the power themselves no longer see it as advantageous and began to actively compete against each other. Therefore, Bismarck acted as an honest broker in the Congress of Berlin 1878, where he has successfully averted a war by delicately balancing the interests between the great powers. In fact, Bismarck would replace the old Vienna system as the sole peacekeeper of Europe and the sole enforcer of the balance of power through his skills and determinations. To understand Bismarck's approach to geopolitics, one must understand the set of security dilemmas Germany inherited from her unique geography. Germany's central location in Europe with 9 bordering nations fundamentally defines Germany's politics and strategy. Sandwiched between the other great powers, any military conflict could cut Germany off from her marital trade and creating a potentially two-front war scenario. This was Bismarck's worst nightmare, and also for the other German high commands, fearing that a hostile combinations of Austria, France and Russia would crush Germany. To prevent this scenario, Germany could not afford to be politically isolated. The solutions was simply to allies with 2 of the 3 potential enemies and end up being in the majority. Bismarck has successfully integrated Germany into his elaborate system of alliance known as the League of the Three Emperors, an alliance between the Kaisers of Germany, Austria-Hungary and the Tsars of Russia. Together they would control Eastern Europe and making sure that the restive ethnic groups such as the Pole were kept in check. Bismarck would later emphasize the importance of being one of the 3 on the European chessboard. He said, all politics reduces itself to this formula. Try to be one of the 3 as long as the world is governed by an unstable equilibrium of 5 great powers. As competition and suspicions between great power grew, especially in the Balkan region, Bismarck had to resort to forming a network of secret alliances to prevent Germany from being isolated. However, he was always careful in containing and controlling Austria from provoking Russia in the Balkan region. Bismarck skillfully used balance of power diplomacy to maintain Germany's position and kept peace in Europe in the most challenging time. He would go down in history as one of the greatest statesmen and diplomat. His approach to geopolitics meant there was absolutely no emotional attachment to any of the state's actor. Diplomacy should be, he believed, to deal with realities, calculations of probability, assessing the inevitable misstep in the sudden lure by other actors. The European chessboard at that time suited perfectly to Bismarck's peculiar geniuses and his ability to maintain in his head multiple possible moves by his adversaries. The only problem with Bismarck's system was that it was simply way too complicated. It involved extremely complex and ingenious network of alliances and agreement by means of secrecy, constant maneuver and betrayal. In another word, for this system to work, it required a political genius like Bismarck. Also, by late 19th century, competitions between great powers was so intense that suspicion alone made consensus impossible to achieve. Therefore, this international system was structurally unsustainable. With the arrival of Wihelm II, Bismarck's balance of power would eventually collapse, and the international system slowly degenerated to anarchy. The new Kaiser, insecure as well as erratic, would dismiss Bismarck in 1890 and assume direct control over his nation's policies. Under his leadership, German foreign policy would be aggressive and offensive, interfering in the sphere of influence of other powers overseas to reclaim Germany's place under the sun, and to cement its status as a leading world power by acquiring new colonies and territory across Asia, Africa and the Pacific. His careless and erratic public statement made Germany look unreliable. By abandoning Bismarck's strategic ambiguity, Germany's alliance with Austria-Hungary became increasingly rigid and inflexible. Together with Italy, they were known as the Triple Alliance, against the Triple Entente of France, the United Kingdom, and Russia. Wilhelm II also militarized Germany and challenged British naval supremacy by massively increasing Germany's military budget in what became the Anglo-German naval arms race. By now, the two hostile and highly armed coalitions greatly antagonized one another. The so-called balance of power had long been forgotten, along with the memory of the disastrous Napoleonic War. Lacking any consensus among the great powers themselves, or a strong leader to maintain world peace, the international system was practically an anarchy, and any miscalculations and misstep could set off a domino effect to break the world order apart at any moment now. And all it took was a driver who took a wrong turn, a 19-year-old student, and 2 bullets to trigger one of the worst global conflicts